decorative art, industrial art, and the otherness being modern and contemporary art at the turn of the century, and the touchstone of this really being the Paris 1900 Exposition Universelle, which celebrated the past century's achievements and their potential for the future 20th century. Now, historian Alexander Geppert writes, quote, "This was reflected by the French government's aim of organising the event to showcase the continuity of French preeminence in decorative art from its beginnings to the present day," end quote. Combining perspectives from art design and museum history and archival sources, my paper argues that the exposition's dual focus on historic and contemporary decorative art influenced the collecting aims of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York at a time of new building and development from 1900 to around 1914. In this photograph, taken from the exposition, the domed building second left, which is surmounted by an eagle, is the American Pavilion. And this joined the old world powers of the Turkish and European empires led by Britain on the Quai des Nations, which was the premier place for the foremost nations to exhibit their pavilions. So this really was a symbol of America's assertion as a new world power and a former colony of the British Empire has now become the world's leading industrial nation. By contrast, Britain was in industrial decline. The Victorian era that saw the height of British industrial, imperial and military expansion was coming to a close. And so too was the Victorian reform movement in the decorative and industrial arts, terms that often overlap in the period and refer to artistic products made to be both beautiful and useful. And this was led by the British arts and crafts movement in the second half of the 19th century and its institutional expression, the South Kensington Museum, which was the precursor to the Victoria and Albert Museum. Now, these images are of the Great Exhibition. That's the interior of the nave in 1851. And then I have this exterior of the South Kensington Museum's first permanent building, which sprang up in the 1860s. The museum was founded in 1857. And its first collections came from the Great Exhibition, which, and I quote from a government source at the time, formed a nucleus of modern products around which both historic and contemporary works could be assembled, end of quote. This nucleus of modern products was central to the museum's educational approach to showing the history of art and design from antiquity to the present day, but as well as its aims in reform of contemporary art and design. And part of this involved changing the cultural status of industrial and decorative art by placing them on a par with fine art, that's painting, drawing and sculpture, which appealed to decorative and craft-based cultures outside of the European fine arts, in inverted commas, tradition. Architectural historian Arindam Dutta observes, quote, "From the Metropolitan Museum in New York to a provincial museum in Kabul, Afghanistan, museums using the South Kensington templates were set up in every nook of the world," end quote. The V&A that replaced the South Kensington Museum in 1899 marked the end of what was therefore marked the end of an international museum movement in artistic reform. Now, looking from the South Kensington Museum, sort of Lombardic Gothic style architecture, which was very popular in style of Victorian architecture at the time, This photograph is of the Metropolitan Museum's first building by Calvert Vaux, and it's taken around the 1880s when it was first erected, before it had the facade and all the other buildings, before it was extended. And it shows a Victorian South Kensington style building. As previously mentioned by Dutta, that's because the Met stemmed from the South Kensington template, which is recognised by museum historians on both sides of the Atlantic, like Michael Conforti and the American museum historian Kathleen Curran. The Met therefore shares a heritage with the V&A that makes these museums uniquely valuable sites to compare changes to their architecture, collecting, and methods of display. This photograph shows a new architectural approach that began to spring up around 1900. Grand new facade buildings added to the V&A on the left really completed the V&A as an art museum in 1909. And on the right is the new grand facade Beaux Arts building designed by Richard Morris Hunt, and it opened in 1902. Now, they show a new architectural direction, but as well as a new artistic direction. But they proceeded from very different starting points in relation to decorative and industrial art in 1900. The Met was only just beginning to collect quality collections of European decorative art, which tended not to include the modern industrial kind that the V&A historically was a growth point of. Art historian Christine Wallace-Laidlaw explains that the Metropolitan Museum was not always interested in industrial art. In 1912, when the Newark Museum organised an exhibit of objects designed by members of the German Werkbund, the Metropolitan refused to mount it, sneering that it did not wish to be connected with anything commercial. And that was during the days when John Pierpont Morgan was president of the Metropolitan. The retired banker, John Pierpont Morgan, sorry, I've gone too quickly, was president of the Met from 1904 until his death in 1913. His dislike for modern industrial art was equal to his passion for medieval and Renaissance decorative art. This slide shows a decorative art wing that Morgan commissioned soon after becoming president from the leading American architect Charles McKim. I argue it's linked to the construction of the V&A's facade building and its new artistic direction. This headline, for example, from the New York Times refers triumphantly to when the director of the V&A, Sir Caspar Purdon Clark, halfway through the construction of its facade building in 1905, was persuaded by Morgan to become the new director of the Met, as work began on its decorative arts wing. The buildings and the new artistic direction that they ushered, I observe, are also linked through the making of two new collections first identified at the Paris 1900 Exposition. This 14th century ivory French casket was exhibited in the Petit Palais, built especially for the Exposition, now the City of Paris Museum of Fine Arts, in the retrospective of French decorative art from its origins to 1800. Art historian Flaminia Gennari Centauri writes that it was here that Morgan saw, quote, for the first time, many objects that he would relentlessly pursue in the following decade, end quote. Now, this casket was part of a larger collection Morgan acquired from the collector Baron Albert Oppenheim in Paris. And today it's in the collection of the Metropolitan, but Morgan first displayed it on long-term loan in the V&A in 1906. And as you can imagine, New Yorkers were not happy about this. As this headline shows, from the New York Times. It reads, Baron Oppenheim's collection bought by J. Pierpont Morgan is shown to London, but not to New York. Our ridiculous tariff prevents bringing over ancient statues and relief. Now, tax duties may have been one reason, another may have been the political landscape in New York at the time, because the very same year, Morgan also gifted to the Met two prestigious collections of decorative art that he also first saw at the retrospective in the Petit Palais in 1900. These belonged to Parisian architect and designer George Hoentschel, which Morgan bought for $1.5 million. Now, design historian Daniel Kisluk-Grushid writes, quote, in pursuing both fine arts as well as decorative or useful arts, the Metropolitan's collecting policy was similar to that of other American institutions. None of these sister institutions, however, could boast at this early state of outstanding holdings of French medieval art comparable to those of the Hoentschel collection. Thus, these collections raised the status of European decorative art in the Met, as well as the Met's standing nationally and internationally. Now, McKim's new decorative arts wing was commissioned to display this collection. At the same time, around the same time, on the other side of the Atlantic, the V&A that displayed Morgan's loan collection, in the V&A, Morgan's loan collection also moved a year earlier into this interior, which was the V&A's new loan court inside the facade building, which opened in 1909. It's now fashion. The collection was displayed here until Morgan's collection was displayed here until 1912, and hopes were raised that Morgan would donate at least part of his collection, if not all of his collection, to the museum, which did much work in cataloguing and researching and really raising the national and international profile of Morgan's decorative art collection. The British historian Frederick Harrison wrote in the Times of the influence of Morgan's loans on Britain's national collections. And I quote, at last, Mr. Pierpont Morgan and other collectors have compelled the old rules to be enlarged and have enabled the public to enjoy the sight of what such public spirit had offered them. The V&A had led the way in this, and since its foundation has been immensely enriched by works of art lent for exhibition, but which not seldom passed to it by gift or bequest. In other words, end of quote, sorry. In other words, private collections displayed on loan in the V&A were often donated to the museum. However, this wasn't the case with the Morgan's loan collection, which in 1912 he had shipped along with the rest of his collection, which he had kept in various holdings in Europe, and he moved this in 1912 to New York. Now, after his death, he left his collection to his son Jack, and it was Jack who loaned his collection the following year to the Metropolitan, where it was displayed in its entirety for the first time as the loan exhibition of the J. Pierpont Morgan collection. And this is just one room in which the collection was exhibited. It was enormous. It was exhibited throughout all different locations within the museum. And it was exhibited for 2 years. It closed in 1916, and later in 1917, Jack donated 7,000 objects from his collection to the Met, from where the decorative arts objects came to be displayed in the decorative arts wing. And in 1918, this was named the Pierpont Morgan wing. So this sequence of events, the transfer of Morgan's collection from the V&A to the Met, and the transitions between these new architectural spaces, the transfer of the collection, that's been written about in histories of both museums, by Conforti, by Anthony Burton, for example, but not in relation to each other before. A new perspective here comes from studying the collection and the transitions between their new architectural settings. Now, I'll come back to these new architectural settings after first exploring the second collection, which was Art Nouveau, acquired from the Paris 1900 Exposition, this time for the V&A. And again, it was first exhibited in the V&A in 1901, at the same time that Morgan was exhibiting his loan collection there. This table and chair set by the artist Eugene Gaillard is now in the V&A's collection. And it has an acquisition number, which is interesting. It's 1900, the date it was acquired, and then 1981, which is less clear. And that's because from 1908 or around 1908 until 1981, it was entirely absent from the V&A. And this wasn't an isolated incident, because actually the vast majority of the V&A's modern and contemporary collections were moved along with the Art Nouveau Museum from the V&A to its Bethnal Green Museum, branch museum, around 1908, 1909. Here again, in making the collection, Clarke had played a key role. He applied to the Board of Education for £500 to make a representative collection for the V&A, which the board granted. The collection was later added to by a gift of 30 pieces of furniture by the furniture expert George Donaldson, who advised Clarke in making the collection. However, just returning to the reason why it was moved from the V&A, along with the other modern and contemporary collections in 1908, the architectural historian Nicolau Pevsner observes, and I quote, "When in 1900 some objects of continental Art Nouveau were presented to the Victoria and Albert Museum, a letter of protest was sent to the Times, signed by 3 architects of the Norman Shaw School with arts and crafts sympathies," end quote. And Pevsner argues that this led to, it revealed an anti-modern backlash in national principles of art and design, which in turn eventually led to the V&A's withdrawal from modern and contemporary art and design. So the movement, he argues, then passed to Art Nouveau and the continental Europe and North America. A new insight this paper offers is that it also brought the V&A's collecting further into line with the historic focus of the Metropolitan. Again, the Morgan loan collection, which remained in the V&A, this highlights the collection. Furthermore, the collection was due to the Morgan collection moved from the location on the left, which is the V&A's South Court, to the 1909 equivalent, which was the new loan court, the Octagon Court. And so this really indicated the museum's intentions to maintain a focus on historic medieval and Renaissance art, having purged the modern and contemporary art from its walls. Now, the photograph of the Octagon Court taken on the right was taken in 1911, when Morgan's collection was still displayed there. Although the photograph information doesn't verify this, it's possible that Morgan's collection was in the cases that we're looking at now. The photos show the vast scale of these lone courts, but also their different styles of interior design and display. The South Court on the left, the Victorian interior, is decorated by ornate ironwork and mural painting and mosaics. There are arranged in cases, there are display cases arranged in series of uniform rows with little space between them, the space breaking the flow of space between the exhibits. They give a crowded impression. By comparison, the interior of the Octagon Court, right, shows classical arches, but otherwise its walls are plain and they are painted in pale neutral tones. At the 1909 opening of the facade buildings, the English art critic Claude Phillips compared their interiors to a modern hospital. And this treatment was carried out throughout the 1909 facade building. Now, we know that the Morgan Loan collection moved from here to New York. First, I'm just going to the new decorative arts wing, but first I'm just going to look at some Victorian interiors of the Metropolitan, which highly similar to the V&A South Court. You see the ornamental ironwork and decorative backgrounds and the uniformity of just rows and rows of display cases with, in this case, it's decorative art displayed within. But Morgan's collection moved into this interior, which opened just a year after the V&A's Octagon Courts, which was McKim's new decorative arts wing. Now, before looking at this in detail, I want to compare it briefly. Oh, sorry, no. Now, the interior of McKim's wing is plainer, and there is more space between the exhibits. There's more flow of space, and we see that there's a move away from using display cases in serial rows. So the flow of space is much improved. In addition, the Met's Bulletin of 1910 describes how McKim, in designing the new wing, decided on, and I quote, "a building planned and executed with reference to its internal needs and effects," end quote, which anticipates a modern form follows function approach to museum architecture. A key difference, however, is where the modern museum that emerged in the 1930s, most famously its institutional form in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and the Goodwin and Stone building that opened at the New York World's Fair. That this was really designed to unify with the nature of modern and contemporary art displayed within, and to reflect it. McKim's wing was explicitly designed to display medieval and Renaissance decorative art.
Sorry, Laura. Sorry,
yes.
Laura, to interrupt you just a moment to say that you have very few minutes to conclude so that we can have space for Q&A.
Yes, I'm concluding now, sorry.
Thank you.
So I begin to question the nature of plainness and spaciousness in this setting, if there are different types of proto-modern interior design here. Furthermore, this early modern type of display setting was a conduit to others in the Met in displaying non-Western art like Islamic decorative art and Chinese decorative art seen here. And this is a particularly very modern in display setting that we can see. In conclusion, what emerges from comparing these developments of the V&A and the Met before and after 1900 is the extent to which they intersected with collections leading from the Paris 1900 Exposition. The paper has shown the Morgan Loan collection represented a thread from the Exposition to the V&A, and from here to the Metropolitan's new decorative arts wing. For, in each case, the display of historic art. Reflecting on the V&A's Art Nouveau collection, this revealed an anti-modern feeling, but led to an absence of modern and contemporary art from the museum, bringing it into alignment with the historic focus of collecting in the Met. So a final thought is that the future could have been so different if the Art Nouveau collection had remained in the V&A, had it been displayed in the early modern settings of the Octagon Loan Court. It would have resulted in a unity of modern art and museum architecture that is prescient of the modern museum that was instituted by MoMA in the 1930s. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you for your patience. Sorry for going over.
Thank you so much.